Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Kneehigh Theatre's The Bacchae. So, like Tristan and Isolde, which I've done a video about previously, this is a multi-authored piece. According to the copyright notice here, it says Carl Gross, Anna Maria Murphy, Emma Rice, and Kneehigh Theatre are hereby identified as authors of The Bacchae. So once again, we've got that sort of communal aspect of Kneehigh Theatre's dramaturgical approach, this collective approach to creation and performance. This is, interestingly enough, or this was, interestingly enough, intended to be an iconoclastic approach to Euripides' The Bacchae. And as Carl Gross says in the foreword that's printed in this particular edition, the Kneehigh Anthology Volume 1, as ever, Emma approached the source material in her own personal and iconoclastic way. She wanted a tutu-clad all-male chorus playing the women of Thebes and big music hall sing-along numbers for the audience to join in with. She staunchly disregarded the classical conventions Euripides had set up. Characters were expanded, journeys threaded through with greater complexity, and there was even the invention of a few new faces. Enter Pamela, PA to King Pentheus. Gone was the archaic translation. In place, a combination of rap and poetry, haikus, and Hungarian Godspeak. So this is a really interesting thing. And slightly later in this foreword, Gross does acknowledge that this iconoclastic approach was challenging because of the complexity, the depth, and actually the relevance of Euripides' play. But I would actually argue that an iconoclastic approach to Euripides, particularly to the Bacchae, and particularly when you're challenging things like gender performance, is really complicated to pull off, because Euripides himself is rather iconoclastic. So I think what's interesting about the play, and the thing is, I don't believe that this play is a failure in that sense. It's not like an ideological failure to be challenging or to be, in some sense, revolutionary, but what I think they don't succeed in doing is knocking down Euripides. What I think they succeed in doing is using Euripides to knock down very traditional ideas about gender roles, issues of religious fanaticism and religiously motivated violence, but also the cultural image of Euripides and the Greek dramatists as these white marble, toga-wearing, rational figures of high culture. Because the thing is, Euripides isn't, in many ways, that. Euripides is very, very challenging, and he's dynamic and interesting, and he raises questions about the gods and whether they exist, whether they're good. I mean, the Bacchae, man, it's an incredibly challenging play if you take people like Hesiod and Homer at their words about the gods basically being good. Euripides is not sure of this. So I think in many ways, Kneehigh's production pulls through these threads of questioning and challenging conventions that we already see in Euripides, that he is already doing, and they take them into the modern era. They modernize them. Yes, I mean, we get rap music, we get contemporary club music, we get electronic technology, etc., etc. But, I mean, this is already a play that undermines gender roles, so having a chorus of Bacchants who are men in tutus that doesn't necessarily challenge what Euripides is doing. That's taking what Euripides, in my opinion, that's taking what Euripides is doing and saying, look, modern world, fuck your gender conventions. Because that's what Euripides does, is there is that element of your gender conventions fall in the face of ecstatic divinity. And that's what we get here. So that's an interesting element of it. And I think it's a very cool play for that reason. It's a very cool adaptation for that reason. There's some other interesting things here. A couple of which I do want to talk through specifically. One is that Dionysus speaks a lot of what I think is Hungarian, based on the note in the foreword about Hungarian God-speak. Their whole section, and I don't read Hungarian, so I'm assuming just from that introduction that this is what it is, but there's whole sections, whole speeches Dionysus gives that are in Hungarian. But then there's this character named Koryphaios, who's a chorus leader, or the chorus leader. The first time Dionysus appears and speaks 7 lines of Hungarian, Koryphaios says, they don't understand you. You must speak in English, for we are in Leeds. Which is also interesting, because Kneehigh Theatre is basically a Cornish company, as I understand it. Though this play did premiere at the West Yorkshire Playhouse in September of 2004. So, we have that meta-theatrical element here. And again, this is a thing that we saw with Tristan and Isolde as well, is that Kneehigh Theatre doesn't believe in the fourth wall. So, they very directly refer to being in Leeds for this performance. Another thing that they do that actually does differ dramatically from Euripides and from all of the Greek tragedians is that we have violence staged here. The death of Pentheus is actually staged. None of the Greek dramatists put violence on stage as a general rule. Violence tended to be reported by messengers. And actually, earlier in the play, there's an instance where Pam gets sent by Pentheus to spy on the Bacchans, which she does, and she gets spotted and chased by them, but then they turn their attention to a field of cows, whom they rip apart. But in scene 14, we have the scene where Agave, who's Pentheus's mother, spots Pentheus dressed up as a Bacchant and come to spy on them. And Agave sees a lion, and she kills this lion. The last stage direction. I'll read you. This is mostly stage directions in this scene. It starts, Agave sees Pentheus and points him out to the Bacchae. The Bacchae surround Pentheus. They taunt, bully, and assault him. The Bacchae rip off Pentheus's clothes. Then Pentheus says, I am Pentheus, son of Achaon, I am your king. According to the stage directions, the Bacchae pour wine over Pentheus's face, beat him, and tear his pants off. The Bacchae call to Agave. She appears at the top of the hoarding and climbs down. She is topless, wearing a red tutu, and is covered in blood. The Bacchae become monsters. Agave dances a dance of death with Pentheus. Dionysus watches. Pentheus says, Mother, it's me. Can't you see I'm your son Pentheus? And then the last stage direction of the scene, Agave tears Pentheus's head off. So, again, this is unlike the Greek dramatists because violence is very rarely staged. Here, violence is set on stage. And I'd really actually love to have seen how this was staged, because with something like Sarah Kane's Phaedra's Love, one of the critiques, because Sarah Kane sent out, one of her stated purposes with Phaedra's Love was to perform the violence and sex on stage that the Greeks did off stage. And one of the critiques that at least some reviewers had of that play was that the violence felt cartoonish, almost. It didn't seem compelling, because we know, like, when someone on stage's guts are pulled out or something like this, we know that that person is not really being disemboweled. So I'd love to see how they staged Pentheus's head being torn off. Whether it was like a ritualized approach, which I think is probably the smarter way to go, or whether they tried to do this almost more like a Hell House type situation, where it's like, oh, here's a bunch of fake gore, and ooh, scary. I kind of hope they didn't do it that way, but I mean, so that's an interesting theatrical problem, right? Is in the Greek versions, a lot of the tension and the horror was created by allowing the audience to imagine this violence. But when you're actually staging it, when you're showing us someone's head being ripped off or something like that, you have to do a compelling job showing us that in order to get us to believe that that's actually happening. So that's an interesting one. The other thing that strikes me about this play, and I'm not real happy with. I think it in some way weakens the play. Because one of the things that's great about Euripides' Bacchae is the ambiguity of it. And that's an ambiguity that lends itself to tragedy. Was there a way that Pentheus and Agave could have averted their fates if they had not done X thing? If Pentheus had not challenged Dionysus, if he had agreed to allow the worship of Dionysus, if he had agreed that Dionysus was a god, could his fate have been averted? That's an open question in Euripides' version, in part because tragedy is driven on the ambiguity of fate. And this is one of the things that a lot of contemporary philosophers, contemporary classicists, readers of tragedy, critics of tragedy broadly agree on, is that fate in tragedy is driven by a combination of human action, i.e. we do things, we are hubristic, etc., but also divine force. And the Bacchae, I think, very clearly explores this tension. Euripides' Bacchae, that is, very clearly explores this tension. But I think in Kneehigh's version, a lot of that tension is undercut, because from the first scene in which Dionysus appears, which is scene 2, fairly early in the play, he does say, "The trap is set. I have thrown the net and I almost have her. Agave, she's nearly mine. I've come to teach them that to worship me is divine, that my mother Semele spoke the truth, that I am truly the god Dionysus, son of Zeus." So I feel like, and it's been a year or so probably since I read Euripides' version of the Bacchae. I don't remember that section in there. It's possible it is in there and I'm just forgetting it, in which case this argument is sort of null. But I think if you got a Dionysus who, toward the beginning of the play, says overtly, I am here for revenge, it's fate, there's nothing they can do to avoid it, it kind of undercuts the tragic element of it for me. I think you need that ambiguity to really have tragedy function in the way it does on the Greek stage.